From sexual fantasies to the price of a pint, it's estimated that our brain processes over 50,000 conscious or unconscious thoughts per day. As a highly sophisticated control system for our body, it also contains over 100,000 miles of blood vessels. And as technology advances, we are learning more and more about this incredible jelly-like mass of fat and protein in our heads that we call the brain. Coming up in the programme, Jonathan undergoes an MRI scan to confirm his brain is in working order.
Is everything okay? I mean, this is my brain.
Aoibhinn looks at some cutting-edge research in the fight against epilepsy. And I'll be finding out about a new kind of bank with some very strange deposits.
The human brain weighs just 1.5 kilos. It's made up of about 70% water, and yet it's the most complex part of the human body. It controls how we move, how we think, and how we perceive the world around us. But it's only in recent years that scientists have come to better understand how it works. It's a beautiful day here in Trinity College Dublin, and I'm at the Lloyd Institute where I'm going to have my very first brain scan with an MRI. Wish me luck. MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, uses a strong magnetic field and radio frequency waves to produce highly detailed images of internal organs and tissues. I must admit, it's a bit disconcerting being rolled into the machine with that helmet on. It also makes some strange noises when it's working that can take a bit of getting used to. The next day, I'm back at Trinity to sit down with Dr. Nick Mahoney to talk through the images from my MRI scan.
This is the images of my brain that we took yesterday. And obviously the first question is everything okay? I mean, this is my brain.
Yeah, as far as I can see here, the brain looks perfectly normal, Jonathan.
I mean, it's beautiful. I know it's my brain, so I probably shouldn't be saying that, but it is incredible what we can see. What can an MRI tell us about what's inside our heads?
Well, MRI is particularly good for brain imaging because the brain contains a lot of water and fat. So the physics of MRI allows us to actually pick out areas of the brain, say, for example, here, these grey zones here, which would be the cell bodies of the neurons within your brain, and then this white matter here. The other thing you see about the brain here is that, in fact, it has a hollow centre. So this region here, this really...
That's a hole.
It is, well, it's a space. It's not filled with fluid, with cerebrospinal fluid.
Right, okay.
So they're called the ventricles. Another interesting area is this bundle of white matter and this bundle of white matter here, and that's part of a thing called the corpus callosum, which allows the right side of the brain to connect to the left side of the brain.
The right side of the brain is said to be more orientated towards performing visual spatial tasks, while the left side of the brain is more focused on language, speech and hearing.
One of the amazing things about MRI, I guess, must be the fact that it's a 3D image that you can sort of pass through the brain from left to right and from top to bottom. That must be so much more empowering than just a simple 2D image from before.
Certainly, and that's what the radiologists who are specialising in neuroimaging do. Part of their job, they use the utility in MRI, which allows us to scroll backwards and forwards like this, to see how one bit merges in with another, and to make sure there's continuity there and the structures are all kind of fit into the right place. And in this case here, as well as the brain, we've been able to show you here the orbit, and there's your eye.
It's unbelievable.
And as if you scroll out a little bit more, we might even be able to see the optic nerve. There it is. There's the there's the nerve there.
Which I'm using right now to see what I'm seeing.
You're using right now to see the back of the eye.
When I had my MRI scan, obviously in the back of my mind, I was sort of hoping that nothing unusual would show up. But what happens when your brain starts to do something it shouldn't? Epilepsy is a common neurological condition, the main feature of which is seizures. The brain contains around 100 billion excitable cells or neurons that send electrical signals to one another. Other neurons dampen down this excitability, but when there's an imbalance between the neurons and large numbers of them fire at the same time, a type of electrical storm occurs in the brain, which results in a seizure. FM DJ Rick O'Shea had his first seizure when he was 16 years old.
It was quite dramatic. It was a Christmas day. I had been playing board games with my brother. I was 16 and I was at home, and I stood up and my mother tells the story about how I got a strange look on my face and I fell over and took the Christmas tree with me. And that was it, seizure number 1. No history of it in the family, and I woke up in St. James's Hospital.
That must have been quite scary for your mum.
Yeah, they had no idea as to what exactly had happened and as to whether it was going to happen again. There are people who, even though they're medicated and medications are changed and moved, that they have seizures 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 30 times a day. And for some people, they can end up in a situation that's known as sudden unexplained death in epilepsy, where you simply have a seizure and you just never come out the far side. I'm on medication every day. I have been since I was 16, but I'm medicated to the point where the last time I had a seizure was over 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago now. And that's the best possible outcome for me that I can have from this situation. Driving is a problem. I only got my driving license 3 years ago because I'd attempted to learn how to drive. I knew how to drive on a number of occasions, but I'd keep having seizures, so that knocks you back off the road for a year at a time.
Attitudes to people with epilepsy have not always been positive. In medieval times, it was seen as evidence of demonic possession and led to people being burnt at the stake.
Thankfully, it's a lot different these days. I think attitudes have changed, certainly in the decades since I was originally diagnosed. I mean, it was something that wasn't really talked about at the time. These days, I like to think that, I mean, through the work of Epilepsy Ireland, which is the charity that I'm involved with, they spend huge amounts of time going into schools, talking to teachers and to pupils and trying to just get the word out there of exactly what it is people should do if they see somebody having a seizure.
What would you like to see in terms of research in the next few years?
Ideally, anybody with epilepsy will tell you that they'd love to see one pill that you can take in the morning and you never have seizures again. But as to if or when that will ever happen, I don't know.
Rick is one of nearly 40,000 people living with epilepsy in Ireland. It's one of the most common neurological conditions and yet remains hugely challenging to scientists due to the highly complex nature of the brain. At the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, Professor David Henschel is investigating one particular branch of epilepsy.
The main type of epilepsy which we look at here is temporal lobe epilepsy. This is actually the most common form of epilepsy that we see in adults. And it involves a part of the brain, the side, the temporal lobe, and this part of the brain is involved in sort of processing sensory information, so things that we see, smell, touch, and also certain types of memory.
Tracy Barton's 3 daughters have all been diagnosed with epilepsy. Twins Hannah and Emma both have temporal lobe epilepsy, which requires careful monitoring and medication.
Emma was diagnosed when she was 2.5 in 2008, and Hannah was diagnosed when she was 4 in 2010, and Sarah was diagnosed with epilepsy when she was 6. To be honest, and to put my hand on my heart, I hate it. I hate epilepsy. It's in the back of our family. It's always going to be there. You can never have a warning of when it's going to jump forward on you. It's, you know, everything's motoring along fine, and before you know it, the seizure will pop back in, and then everything gets thrown up again in the air. You're constantly, as a parent, constantly watching. And it could be any time that it can come. You know, you could be swimming, you could be in the bath, you could be in the shower, you could be getting out of a car, getting out of a bus, walking, anything at all, and it can just strike. There is no pattern as such that it will happen. With the girls, I try and keep them that they'd have a regular bedtime. Tiredness can play a huge factor on allowing seizures to creep back in, so we do try and have a steady routine as much as possible, obviously. They're only children and they shouldn't have to be, you know, going through this all the time, and unfortunately it's something that's there.
Despite Hannah and Emma both having the same type of epilepsy, doctors have been unable to find a common link between their conditions. David's research at RCSI is looking at the mechanisms that may underpin common forms of epilepsy.
We think it has a lot to do with the activity of genes within the brain. In order for neurons to function properly, they need a certain number of genes to be active. And so what we know in epilepsy is that some of the genes that should be turned on are actually turned off, and some of the genes that should be turned off are actually turned on. And we think that it's this change in gene activity within the brain that is causing this long-lasting sort of instability. What we've been interested in really is understanding what controls the activity of the gene, so what turns it on and what turns it off.
As part of their research into gene activity in the brain, the team here at RCSI began to look at a specific process called DNA methylation. Dr. Suzanne Miller-Delaney looked at whether this process was different in the brain of a person with epilepsy compared to someone without.
If you think about it, every cell in your body has the same DNA in it. But what makes a cell a heart cell or a bone cell or a brain cell is the combination of which genes in it are switched on and switched off. So DNA is like the recipe book for your entire life. And if you think of it that way, if you think of it as a recipe book where each page of the book has the recipe or the code for a gene on it, DNA methylation is like paper clips holding together some of those pages so that the recipes for those genes can't be read and the genes can't be switched on.
And tell me, how does this relate then to your research in epilepsy?
So we know that DNA methylation is important in some diseases, like diabetes and cancers, but we don't know about epilepsy. So what we did was we took samples from patients with epilepsy and look at the DNA methylation profile of those patients and see was there any differences between people who had epilepsy and control samples. We had 14 brain samples. Now, 5 of those were control and 9 of them were from epilepsy patients.
Now, to me, that sounds like a very small sample size.
Yeah, it is small, but we looked at thousands of areas of the genome in those samples. So we looked at over 30,000 areas of the genome. And what we found actually was when we looked at the epilepsy patient samples, they were kind of consistent in their results. So we didn't need an awful lot more patients.
This type of painstaking analysis of brain DNA had never been done before, and the team at RCSI made some significant discoveries.
A lot of the genes that we found in this study were actually genes that hadn't been previously associated with epilepsy. So these could be novel targets for drugs to treat people with seizures that can't be controlled. So all the time we're finding out more and more and being able to understand more and more about the differences between patients in epilepsy.
So we're optimistic that if we can understand what turns genes on and off within the brain of a patient with epilepsy, that we might have new types of drugs that will act really on what's underlying the disease itself. And by doing that, we may be able to get much further into stopping seizures occurring or perhaps even curing epilepsy.
Research is unbelievably important. It's crucial. There's a lot of medications that will help the majority bring their seizures under control, but unfortunately for some minority, and it might be a large minority as well, they cannot get seizures under control, and it's such a major strain on your life, on your relationship, on their mental health. It's just crucial. Research is really crucial, and what Professor Henshaw is doing is just, it'd be brilliant that they'd be able to find DNA markers in brain tissue, and then obviously the next step to then try and bring some medication in line with that would just be amazing for anybody that has epilepsy.
Coming up after the break, Fergus looks at the surprising benefits of cerebral cannibalism. And Kathriona pays a visit to a bank with the most unusual deposits.
Brain-eating tribes and modern medicine don't usually crop up in the same sentence. But scientists studying a remote tribe in Papua New Guinea have discovered the dangers and benefits of eating human brains. In the 70s, it was discovered that this tribe had a very morbid funeral tradition. When a member died, instead of burying the body, the tribe would feast on the brain. This ritualistic cannibalism led to an epidemic of Kuru disease in the tribe. Kuru is similar to mad cow disease in cattle, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, in humans. These are caused by misshapen proteins called prions. Usually a protein will fold itself into a particular arrangement to carry out its role. When this folding goes wrong, a prion is formed. This acts as a template to change healthy proteins into prions, which accumulate in the brain, leading to damage and death. While this funeral feasting has since stopped, scientists studying the tribe this year have discovered they have a small genetic mutation in one of their proteins. This prevents any misfolding from occurring, making them immune to both Kuru and CJD, which is of huge interest to scientists studying these diseases. It is a perfect example of Darwinian evolution. Because Kuru disease was so widespread in the tribe, the small genetic mutation was selected for, as it gave immunity to the next generation. So while the brain eating gave rise to a problem, eventually evolution gave rise to a solution. Now that's cerebral cannibalism at its strangest. See you next time.
The brain is susceptible to many different disorders that could appear at any stage of life. As researchers try to unravel the mysteries of what goes on inside our heads, accessing brain tissue is becoming increasingly important. And we're asking people their opinions about brain donation. So when you die and you donate your brain to medical research, I was wondering, what do you think about that, and would you be interested in doing it yourself?
Yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Oh, I think it's one of the best things you can do, because my brain could help someone else not die. I suppose the best way I can think of putting it.
Definitely. I don't know, I suppose it's a bit of a controversial subject anyway, you know, organ donor and all that sort of thing. So I suppose having some fiddling with my brain, I'm not too sure about.
I think it would be advantageous for everyone. And to help Alzheimer's, we're trekking into that side.
Donating any organ is a hugely valuable service, and in the case of brain donation, can vastly improve our knowledge of medical science. Alma McInerney has made the brave decision to donate her brain after her death. She's been diagnosed with a syndrome called OPCA that leads to a degeneration of neurons in specific parts of the brain.
I started by falling down the stairs without any warning whatsoever, and I hit every step on the way of a straight staircase down. That was the first time.
And when was that?
In 1975.
Okay, so you've had the condition for a while then?
Oh, I have indeed. I found out about the Dublin Brain Bank when I was attending Dr. Lynch's to see the why and the wherefore of my falling. I stopped for a few minutes and thought about it, and realised I won't be there, so what difference does it make if it's going to be of some use, either information-wise or donation-wise? Somebody else might make use of it.
In 2008, the Dublin Brain Bank was set up as a collaboration between the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and Beaumont Hospital to provide brain tissue for researchers.
Essentially, a brain bank is a repository of very carefully studied brain tissues and indeed spinal cord tissues from patients, both healthy patients and patients with neurologic disease of all kinds. The advances in imaging of the brain over the last 10 years have been truly spectacular. But we're not at the stage yet where we can actually see reliably the abnormal proteins that cause many of these neurodegenerative diseases. And it's only by studying the brain after death and by relating it back to the imaging that you can begin to correlate the ante-mortem imaging findings with the post-mortem brain findings, so that the researchers who then use the brain tissue for whatever questions they want to answer know exactly at what stage in the illness this patient was and what the pathology of that part of the brain was before they go on and study it.
There are currently 280 brains stored at the Dublin Brain Bank. The brains were donated by people with Alzheimer's and dementia, motor neuron disease and Parkinson's disease. But there's one type of brain they desperately need.
We have very limited healthy brains, which is a problem that all brain banks face around the world, really. We'd like more people to sign up.
We have up to 72 hours, but as soon as somebody passes away, their DNA, RNA and protein begin to degrade. So it's really important that the people call us straight away. We would liaise with the undertakers, with the hospitals to get the body here as quick as we can, and then we would retrieve the brain here in Beaumont. Half of it is put in formalin and it's fixed for 2 weeks, and that's used for pathological diagnosis. The other half, it's cut into slices, and different sections, up to 22 sections, are taken from that, and those sections are snap frozen in liquid nitrogen.
And they're for future use?
Yeah, so they will be given to different research groups around Ireland.
To date, the Dublin Brain Bank has collaborated with researchers all across Ireland on projects relating to Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. And how long do you store the brains for?
So we store it infinitely. On the forms, there is an area where they can sign whether they would like us to dispose of the brain whenever we are finished with it. But up until now, we've stored all the brains, so we haven't gotten rid of any.
Because I suppose you could store that for forever. Donated brain tissue is retained by the Brain Bank for a very long time, so making family members aware of what's involved in the process is very important.
Certainly when someone dies and whatever, there's often distress in the family, and then it's difficult if the doctor or whoever's asking, is it okay for the brain to be donated? The first thing, oh, there's often a bit of recoil. So bizarrely, I often have this conversation, nearly sometimes in the first visit when I see a patient, that I bring this concept up and explain the idea behind it so that they're aware of it. And most people say, well, okay, that makes sense. I'll have a look at it and have a discussion with the family, and then they can have a logical discussion in the cold light of day and say, yeah, all right, that makes sense, or no, I don't fancy that. So that's well done in advance.
So did you tell your family about your wishes?
Indeed.
Did you have to convince them at all?
Well, I was pretty good at brainwashing them when I started. And I'd come back and haunt them if they didn't know exactly what I said.
You can come back and haunt them. That's not very nice.
Yes, you can, if they don't do what they're told.
Our understanding of the brain has greatly increased in recent years, thanks in no small part to donors like Alma and the work of the Dublin Brain Bank and similar initiatives around the world.
Ireland is at the forefront of research in neurodegeneration, and we're happy to help those scientists with availability of carefully studied human brain tissue. And we're very grateful to the public for donation of those tissues.
Coming up next tonight, Eileen Dunn has the main evening news with a weather forecast from Jerry Murphy. Then the Gardaí appeal for your help in solving the crimes for this month's crime call at 9:35. And then the Archbishop Diarmuid Martin talks about gang crime on Clareburn Live at 10:35.